to the debate on Bill 150, the Toronto Transit Commission Labour Disputes Resolution Act 2011. Now, this is a very simple matter. It's a matter of ensuring that the people of Toronto are not held hostage by unions. That's what this is about. That's what the people of Toronto asked for. They sought this assistance in the October mayoralty election. Rob Ford was clear that he would seek it, so this should serve as no surprise to anyone. If I can recall the three main planks that I heard Rob Ford campaign on, the first one was stop the gravy train, the second one was I'm going to build subways, and the third one is there will be no more TTC strikes. I will ask the province to pass this legislation. That's what Rob Ford said. That's what he's followed through on so far. People voted for him overwhelmingly, and we can only consider that a plebiscite, and therefore, to his credit, the Premier has seen what Rob Ford succeeded in doing in that election and has allowed legislation, government legislation, to be placed before us. They wanted it, the people wanted it, the McGuinty government is granting it, our party is supporting it. The Working Families Coalition might not like this. Note to Premier. Let me take you back, Speaker, to April of 2008. In April of 2008, we were called into special session on a Sunday here in this legislature to consider back-to-work legislation, to send TTC workers who had gone on strike overnight on the Friday preceding, wildcat basis, and caused great grief to a number of people in the City of Toronto. This was the first time that I actually came to this House and felt angry, and that was 6-7 months after I came here for the first time. My anger, as I said at the time, wasn't personal. It was an expression of what I was hearing on the streets of Toronto, and particularly in my riding of Thornhill, which is, after all, on the northern border of Toronto and served largely by the TTC. The TTC people had walked out on a Friday night. They had stranded their riders without notice. And I'd like to quote, Speaker, from Hansard at that time, and this was from myself. This is what I said. I live and work here in Toronto. I use the TTC myself. People are angry, and justifiably so. No one likes surprises. People want dependability, and as the Premier has ably pointed out, people want courtesy. They have indeed extended courtesy this weekend one to another, but they want it in return. People are angry at the Amalgamated Transit Workers Union. They're angry at Mayor David Miller. They're angry at TTC Chair Adam Jambroni, and to an extent they're angry at the McGuinty government. They're angry to the point where the words essential service are being heard, spoken all over this city this weekend. No one likes that, but it is what I've been hearing. Indeed, we, this legislature, are declaring the TTC to be an essential service on a one-time basis this weekend, because people need the TTC. We need the TTC on a regular basis. Ask yourself whether you'd be feeling something akin to anger if you were the nurse who had left a hospital shift at midnight on Friday expecting to get home and had not been able to do so. Ask yourself if you'd been the youngster from my riding who went down to the Toronto Entertainment District on Friday night and got out without the $40 in pocket to get back to Thornhill, absent the TTC. And indeed, Speaker, that is what happened. That's what I said at the time. I felt it then and I feel it now. And obviously there's a sentiment that runs deep in the citizenry of Toronto that feels the same way, or Mayor Ford wouldn't have been reflecting it when he was candidate for it, and he wouldn't have received that kind of a majority and that kind of support if he didn't plan legislation like that. And again, this government has acceded to his request. I did then, and I do now, speak for the constituency of Thornhill. 150,000 residents of that constituency, to a large extent very dependent on TTC in their daily lives. They live and they work here in Toronto. People want and deserve the dependability and the accountability that I said they wanted that one night in 2008. They want it on a go-forward, ongoing basis, and they have little choice. It's the TTC, or it's your car, or it's a cab, or it's your feet. You might not have a car, You might not have money for the cab, and your feet might have to carry you 20 or 30 kilometres, depending on what your disposition is in Toronto at any given time. Even this Premier would agree. He has said that people deserve this. So, we all must agree. Declaring the TTC an essential service must be the right thing to do. It is the desire and it is the need of a mayor and of the majority of this city, and it's not a maybe. Transit is an essential service. With poor infrastructure and Liberal delays on public works projects, and I might cite, Speaker, the Yonge Street North extension from Finch, it comes to mind. Public transit is the lifeblood of a city, and we don't have the arteries to connect. The Liberals have been pandering to unions since they were elected to government in 2003. Unions don't budge. They want the annual raise. They want the defined benefit pension plan. They support the Liberals to get it, and when asked to go slow, they say, no way. Toronto municipal government has until recently been a talking piece for the union bosses. Then we had an election back on October 25th. This bill is not, and I repeat not, about setting blanket policies and outlawing all union collective bargaining. That's not what it's about. It's about ensuring an essential service is afforded to the people of a city where that service is indeed essential. That's all it's about. So lest anybody say, well, you know, there goes Shurman, there goes the PC party, they hate unions, we all know that. I'm a union member myself, have been for 40 years. I am not anti-union. The NDP believes that this legislation will open the door to repeal the Trade Union Act. Don't believe that for one moment. What you should believe is that the NDP is funded largely by trade unions, so that's their message. This is about making sure that that nurse who leaves her shift at midnight on Friday, expecting to get home, can get home, no matter what the dispute. She didn't cause it. It's about the young guy from Thornhill on a Friday night who counts on the TTC to get him home, and not a $40 cab ride he either can't afford or hasn't even got the money in his pocket to pay for. Because he can't afford it. He needs that TTC. So let's take a look at legal obligations to unions and talk a little bit about unions. This bill removes the restrictions placed on governments to bargain with the unions. Politicians have an obligation to account for public monies being spent. Politicians have to begin looking at something that has become a phrase of note in our world as it exists today, and let's remember that the world we're talking about is a very different one than the one we looked at the beginning of the mandate of this government. And I'm not talking about the first mandate, I'm talking about the one we're finishing this year, 207. Things have changed. Okay? And what I'm talking about is a phrase, ability to pay. Ability to pay. We're not going to be Wisconsin here in the province of Ontario, but that's about ability to pay. We're not going to be California here in Ontario, but that's about ability to pay. So we have to be cognizant of the fact that when we deal with unions or any workers, ability to pay plays a part. We, and when I say we, I speak for the taxpayers of my riding, and I believe for taxpayers across the province of Ontario, we are not an ATM that Dalton McGuinty or any other premier of this province can go to any time he needs money. Union negotiations cannot dominate budgets, and so this bill prevents needless spending in order to appease a small segment of the workforce. That's what it comes down to. The thing that unions at this point are not getting, and that they're going to have to understand, is that there is a limited ability and that they are part of the population too. The unions would have people believe that we don't show respect for their members, their taxpayers too. No, we get that. But it's a two-way street. It's a two-way street. Unlike, for example, the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, ETFO, we support Mayor Ford's efforts to respect the taxpayers of Toronto by ensuring that the TTC operates in a fiscally responsible way with stability and in the best interests of Ontarians. I have a letter here from Sam Hammond, the president of the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario. Good afternoon, sir. He's written to all of us. I'm assuming this one's addressed to me, and I'm going to read this letter into the record. I am writing to you on behalf of the 76,000 members of the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario to let you know our opposition to Bill 150, an act to provide for the resolution of labour disputes involving the Toronto Transit Commission. Bill 150 declares the TTC an essential service and strips down the right to strike from TTC workers, members of the Amalgamated Transit Union. We urge you to oppose the bill at every reading in the legislature. There is no doubt the government is introducing this bill at the request of Toronto Mayor Rob Ford. In so doing, the government is pandering to right-wing voters in Toronto and abandoning the workers of this province. I'll read the rest of the letter, but I'm going to interject at this point. How is it possible that Mr. Hammond can make the point that this is pandering to the right-wing voters of Toronto? Everybody knows that voters of Toronto have traditionally been left-wing, and here we have a mayor who is considered more right of centre, who's won an overwhelming majority because people got tired of that. They got tired of pandering. Continuing the letter, Bill 150 was not necessary. The president of the ATU had already indicated his union would not strike during the next round of bargaining. The city manager and the general manager of the TTC are both on record as opposing the essential service designation. Educators in this province will not tolerate this intrusion into free collective bargaining. We stand with members of the ATU in opposing Bill 150. We cannot let the rights of workers be threatened because a mayor or a political party decides to ride out a troubled economy on the backs of working people. Working people did not cause the global recession. That was caused by the greed of a few. Undermining fundamental worker rights, rights enshrined in the ILO covenant signed by Canada, is not an appropriate response. Again, we urge you to oppose this bill. Sorry, Mr. Hammond, I can't oppose this bill. I speak for people in their numbers, in large majority. They don't buy that logic. What they see in a letter like that is arrogant entitlement. Okay, you don't get 3%, give or take, every year, and a defined benefit pension plan that is limited to 30% of this province, while 70% of the workers in this province have no entitlement whatsoever of that sort. They don't have a defined benefit pension plan. They probably, in most cases, don't have any pension plan at all, save and except for their RSPs. They have frozen salaries, or they've taken a cut in salaries, and as we read from polls in the public milieu, over 30% of Ontario families still to this day worry every single day about whether or not they'll have a job going forward. That's the reality. And it's those people, sir, it's those people, I say to all unions that are of that belief, who have to foot the bill for that ongoing entitlement. And you're the same unions who wouldn't budge an inch when Dalton McGuinty made a rather, I might say, mealy-mouthed attempt to get you to cut back a little bit and take one for the team like the rest of us are doing. So I think that Ontarians, and we've seen it in the Toronto election, Torontonians have about had it up to here with that nonsense. Nobody's doing anything on the backs of workers. We believe that what we're looking at here, and this letter personifies it, is essentially a group of people who see themselves as the new elite. Don't you take away our entitlements. We're entitled to our entitlements. No. No. All of us had to take a hit. And you're going to have to take a bit of a hit too. And that's where I relate it back to ability to pay. And you'd better think about this closely, because perhaps you will say the Progressive Conservative Party has a particular stance that you don't like and has historically had that. Well, guess what? Over there is a Liberal Party. They brought in this legislation, and it's organizations like the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario that are putting money into the Working Families Coalition that supports that government over there. Okay, so this is, one could conclude from that, not a conservative perspective, it's a political perspective, because the landscape in this world has changed. And that's what you're going to have to start saying to your members. I say that to unions. Why do they think that they're the only group of hard-working Ontarians? There's always an us and a you, a we and a they. I can tell you, and there's not a complaint to be ascribed to this, I and every other person in this room has had a frozen salary for 3 years. No complaint. We did that. I and every other person in this room contributes to an RSP. That's our pension. People think there's some kind of a lifelong pension that's attached to being a member of this legislature. Not so. Okay, so we're not talking out of two sides of our mouth here. We live the words we say. Why would union members then, in the public sector particularly, believe that they are entitled to large pensions, increases in huge benefit packages, and that the rest of us aren't? There's a need to understand that essentially what we're saying is there's no more money. The reason why you're seeing the upheaval in the United States at the state legislature level, which I don't envision coming to our country because we have a different view of the world, is that they basically came to a conclusion and said, we haven't got any more ability to pay. We use that term in discussing this. We use that term in labor contracts. But in these situations like the one you're seeing in Wisconsin, like you're hearing out of New Jersey, what you're hearing out of California is we can't do it. And you're seeing towns in the United States where they're cutting police forces in half and leaving people in danger because they just don't have ability to pay. There is, as so many people have said, in one level of government or another, only one taxpayer. And that taxpayer has been tapped out. There's a pie, call that the household income, that comes into every house. And there's a little tiny piece for a vacation, maybe, and a little tiny piece for savings, and a large piece that goes for food and shelter and clothing, possibly school expenses, the family car, insurance, and then there's no more pie. The only way to go and get more pie is if you go back to the taxpayers and push those magic buttons on the taxpayer ATM that I talked about before. The taxpayer ATM, Speaker, is empty. So as was seen during the changes made to the Regulated Health Professions Act, when doctors and nurses were deemed essential services, the membership was supportive of this change. We would ask that unions start to understand that they're going to have to take their place with the rest of us and see it the same way. There's precedent. Other jurisdictions have passed the kind of legislation that we're considering today. New York State would be an example. Essential services have to be taken for what they are, essential services. So in closing, let me say, continuing to use the example of the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, because I think that I don't mean to single them out other than the fact that Mr. Hammond wrote the letter, but his organization, as new members of the Working Families Coalition and other unions in that organization, other unions generally believing this, they want us to believe that the rights of workers are somehow threatened by this legislation. We believe that if this bill is not passed, it's the rights of taxpayers, it's the rights of Ontarians that will be threatened. So what this legislation serves to do is to protect the good of the many, the good of the many. All we have to do is remember what happened when the TTC decided to shut down without warning. And all we have to do is remember how we dealt with that on that particular day. The government called us back. We all came in. We sat here for half an hour and we sent them back to work. Why? Because there was an admission, not so tacit, that this was an essential service. And so now the government has put before us government legislation in response to a city request, because we concur with the government and we concur with the city that that indeed is what it is. So when you shut down an essential service, how can that be considered just and fair? This bill is not about greed. It is not about unions. It is about doing the right thing for the hard-working families of Ontario. Thank you, Speaker.
Thank you. Further comments and questions?